Hi, history students. Here we're moving on to Module 2 of our history course. In today's module, we'll be exploring the instrumentation and the orchestra, as well as the history of keyboard instruments and their evolution. We'll also be listening to Benjamin Britten's orchestral work, The Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra. I'm hoping that you'll find this module interesting. The first instrument that we're going to be looking at today is the organ. As you know, the organ is a keyboard instrument, and the organ has been around since the Middle Ages. The simplest way to describe how an organ works is to say that there is air passing through the pipes, and that's what produces the sound. Here's an excellent short video where you can learn more about the organ and experience that organ sound.
You're seeing the world's largest functioning musical instrument. Some 28,500 pipes are in this organ. The ones you see, interestingly enough, don't actually play. The facades of this very, very famous instrument are not speaking. They're just there for show. The pipes are behind the walls. Hi, I'm Peter Richard Conti. My title is Wanamaker Grand Court Organist at Macy's. And this console that you're seeing right now is just the control panel. Looks like a cockpit of a large aircraft. And these are the keyboards, much like piano keyboards. We have 6 of them because there's so many different voices to control. Each one of these keyboards controls a different family or a division of pipes, they're called. And then to my right and left of the keyboards are the actual stops, the voices. And there are 3 symphony orchestras worth of voices. We call the voices on the organ a rank, and this organ has 469 ranks, or players, if you will. Now, organists are part octopus, and the pedal board is the equivalent of the bass end of the orchestra. Is played by the feet. Back when I first started here, in my early part of my tenure, the organ was pretty much dead, if you can believe it. Most of it just didn't function. Macy's came in, and within just a few years, the organ went from hardly playable to now it's 100% playable.
The organ's turning on. The first thing that turned on was the DC power supply to give the power to the organ. You can see all the pilot lights lit. So that's putting out 13 volts for the instrument. And then the next thing that happens is that the 8 blowers throughout the building turn on slowly, one after the other, so we don't take too much current at once. And you can hear the organ coming to life. The air goes through a bellows, which is like a diaphragm regulator, and that controls the final pressure that goes inside the chest. There we go. And then you have a pneumatic under this note that opens and closes and allows the air to come in here when it's called for. So in many cases you have 3 pneumatics per note that have to be maintained and rebuilt. This is where the signals for the orchestral come upstairs and then are distributed into the chamber. This has reeds. You'll see there's all kinds of different shaped resonators for all the reeds in this chamber. You can see the shutters that let the sound out. You can see them opening and closing as he's playing.
Macy's gets the fact that this is an international icon, and it's a Philadelphia treasure as well. And Macy's understands that, and they have really poured their resources into it, and it's a wonderful thing. The organ is in the best shape of its life.
Nice. Okay. Good. That turned out pretty well, actually, yeah.
Two keyboard instruments that are often considered a precursor to the modern piano are the harpsichord and the clavichord. Both of these instruments had strings and they were plucked. After you watch this video, I think you'll have an excellent understanding of the similarity and the differences between the harpsichord and the clavichord, and you'll also be able to see how our modern piano evolved from these instruments.
What we have here is a display of 3 historic and 1 modern keyboard instrument. We've got a harpsichord over here, a late 18th century style piano over here, and a small double-strung clavichord here, and then, of course, a modern Hamburg Steinway. They make them in New York. They also make them in Hamburg, Germany. And I thought it would be a great idea just to see the relative size of the instruments, especially to see how much the piano has grown from this piano to the one right to my left. It would probably be a good idea maybe to start, though, by looking at the clavichord. Now, this is the oldest stringed keyboard instrument we know of. We see pictures of clavichords in the late Middle Ages, and we know that these instruments were popular in one form or another straight up to around the year 1800 and after. The instrument I have right here is a replica of a German clavichord made about 1600. And the sound is very small. The clavichord was never meant to be a public instrument. It was meant to be a private instrument to be played alone or for the listening pleasure of a small number of your best friends, and maybe a very small voice could sing with it. As you can see, the clavichord is just a rectangular box with strings in it. If I open it up like this, I could put a book of music here if I wanted to. And on this instrument, there are 2 strings for every note. But there's a catch there. And that means that some of the keys share the same set of strings. And for that reason, we call it a fretted clavichord. Just like frets on a guitar, where several notes are gotten from one string. For example, F, F sharp, and G are all gotten from the same string. That gives us, to be sure, some disadvantages. You can't play those notes together, but the older music doesn't require them. What it does give us, advantage-wise, is that it makes for less strings to tune, and also for less tension on this resonating box, so the sound from the soundboard here is a lot freer. It sounds like this. Instruments like this were popular from the late Middle Ages all the way to almost after 1800, when historical keyboard instruments like the ones we have here today kind of went into oblivion. But this instrument also would come in larger sizes as time went on. So the clavichords that we have in the 1700s are proportionately bigger than the ones we had about 1600 or so. Here we have a harpsichord, and it has one keyboard. Many people have probably seen harpsichords that have two keyboards. That really just adds another set of strings to the instrument and fulfills different expressive requirements, but fundamentally it's all the same. Now, unlike the clavichord, whose action you could see a second ago striking the strings, on the harpsichord it plucks the string just like you might do on a guitar. And to that end, the harpsichord's action looks like this. Just like the clavichord, every note's got two choirs of strings, except here, every note's got its own two independent set of strings. There's no such thing as a fretted harpsichord. And when I play a key, it levers up a device here called a jack, just like Jack and Jill. And when I take that jack out, in it is a flexible tongue. And in that tongue is a tiny little guitar pick, which we call a plectrum. And that tongue is flexible. It can move so that after I've played my note, that plectrum can fall back over the string. Now you'll hear sort of a pa-da there. The strings are staggered, and that makes for a more sensitive touch on the harpsichord. If you had to muscle down both strings at the same time, the sound wouldn't be as attractive and the player wouldn't have as much control. But these instruments date, as far as we know, from the end of the 15th century, that's the 1400s, all the way to the 1790s, when the harpsichord pretty well went out of fashion and was only brought back into fashion in the 20th century. The stringing in this instrument is brass all the way through, as is the case with the clavichord. And this is a sort of an interesting instrument. It was made by a man named Willard Martin from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And he made it from plans that come from the year 1617. A French fellow named Mersenne designed this instrument. We don't know whether he ever built it or not, but enough instruction existed that Martin could reconstruct this instrument in the 20th century. This particular one was made in Pennsylvania in 1997. And harpsichords can vary from a kind of a delicate lute-like whisper to a pretty brilliant sound. I'll play you a little 16th century dance from the Antwerp Dance Book of 1587, and you'll get an idea of what it sounds like. It's said sometimes that ladies who are less than svelte should dress in slimming black. And we have no better example of that than the modern grand piano and the piano as Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart or Joseph Haydn or the young Ludwig van Beethoven knew it. This piano is a replica of two different instruments. One lives in a museum in Nuremberg in Germany, the other one lives in a museum in Vienna. And they were both made by a man named Anton Walter, spelled just like Walter. He was the one who made the instrument that Mozart finally bought. As you can see, this instrument has 58 notes, whereas the modern piano has 88 notes. So we're 30 notes gone, but this has everything you need to play all the classical period music straight up to almost middle period Beethoven. That's for historical time, probably around 1800. And this is indeed a piano, though I should show you the action to give you an idea of the difference. So I'm going to pull this pin out here, and the action sits on a sled. I have to look down to make sure I don't break any hammers. And out it comes. Now, on this piano, the hammers are leveraged up. When I rock the lever, it pushes a little beak here right past a thing called an escapement. So the hammer can hit the string and then fall right back without making a thunk. The hammer heads are covered with deerskin. And since piano builders were experimenting all the time during this time period, because piano was a new type of instrument, some people use the shiny side of the deerskin up, and some people use the fuzzy side. And this piano uses the fuzzy side. So as you can see, we've got the key lever, the hammer, a thing called a back check so that it doesn't bounce back like someone on a trampoline, and then the escapement so that the hammer can escape and fall back down. Now we'll put the action back in, and we'll hear that the sound of this piano isn't nearly as loud as that of the modern piano. But what it has is an interesting tone color change. If I start by playing really softly and I start to play louder, you're going to hear the actual attack of the sound change. The treble range of the instrument was said in the 18th century to sound a little bit like woodwinds, I think especially clarinet, but the bass, on the other hand, is kind of reedy, and you can understand why in Mozart's piano concertos, even a small instrument like this could stand out with an orchestra. So. Now, you notice, well, those of you who might be able to see my knee down here, there's no pedal on this instrument like there is on a modern piano. If I want to lift the dampers, I do it with my right knee. If I use my left knee, I can interpose a layer of felt in between the hammers and the strings. And that's called a moderator. It disappeared from the piano. It was never on English pianos, which are more the direct ancestors of the modern piano. But when it disappeared, we lost a valuable tone color. It's very kind of muted and muffled. A little bit harp-like. We can imagine it in certain places in Beethoven and other composers. When these Viennese or South German style pianos got bigger, they still kept that moderator stop. And so they had that color as an option into about the 1830s or so. But this is the piano that Mozart would have played his concertos on. And as we can see, when we progress over to the modern piano, that it is, it's gotten a little bit bigger. The modern piano arrives on the scene probably sometime in the 1850s or 60s. And one of the first pianos to really attract a lot of attention as a modern piano is the American Steinway piano. Now we know later that Steinway set up a factory in Germany, and what we have here is a German Steinway. It's from Hamburg in the north of Germany. What I think I'd like to do though is play you just a short selection on each piano, and you can hear for yourself exactly what the difference is between the instruments. So I'm going to give you about 8-10 bars of a Mozart piano sonata on this piano, and then I will take it over to the modern piano. We move now from the South German Viennese style piano to the modern Steinway. And we've just heard that short example from Mozart, and we're going to hear that again on the modern piano. Now, among things that happened before modern pianos really come to be is that this instrument, the Viennese piano, is entirely wood framed. And pianos would be wood framed for 20, 25, maybe 30 years later. But in the 1820s, an American named Babcock invented the idea of a metal part, or metal parts, to support the piano more. The other thing that you can't see, but this instrument has a solid bottom. So the soundboard, like on a harpsichord or a clavichord, forms a baffle. These still owe a certain amount to harps and guitars. But as I move over to the modern piano, we're going to see that nowadays we have a full cast iron plate that sits inside the instrument. You can see that the instrument is much more massive. And this case, the curved case, is made with layers and layers of laminated wood, steamed and bent over a period of about a month. Now, we need this big metal plate in here, and it would take several strong people to put it in, because this instrument, fully tuned like it is right now, supports a pressure of about 30 tons inside. So you want to make sure you never drop one off the stage. That'll implode. But let's hear the Mozart example played on this instrument, and you'll get a difference, or a good sense of the difference of how the instruments make their sounds. Now, the range of Mozart's piano was here to here. There to here. This is called contra F. You'd notate it with two capital F's. This is little f3, F sharp 3, and G3. So again, we've got 58 notes here. We go to 88 notes now on the modern piano. And we have very long strings. Various processes came in that allowed them to build the piano bigger, louder, so that we get a sound of incredible power and brilliance, but the tone color remains basically the same. If I start from the softest sound and go as loud as I can, the volume will change, but the tone color really won't. The tone gets more and more massive, and this just reflects different musical needs. It's probably best to think that each of these historical instruments served the music of its own time best. After all, you wouldn't necessarily restore an old oil painting with acrylic paint. And so even if you choose not to play the historical instruments, if you study them and how they work, it will modify your approach, I think, to make for a clearer, nicer performance on the modern instrument. Those of us who choose to eat everything on the plate will play all the instruments.
It's very important in this course that you understand the orchestra, the instrumentation of the orchestra, and the structure of the orchestra. This short clip should help you understand the orchestra even more.
Ah, the orchestra. The pinnacle of sophistication, acting as the backdrop for the hoity-toity elite and commercials for expensive cars. But really, it's just a group of musicians getting together to make music. How do they make these instruments work? Which instruments are related and why? To start, we can break the instruments into 4 families. Each family is grouped by the way the instrument produces vibration. This kind of classification gives us the string family, the woodwind family, the brass family, and the percussion family. When you think of the orchestra, you most likely think of the violin, or at least some sort of string instrument. This is probably because they make up the majority of the instruments in the orchestra, so good thinking. All string instruments use string vibration to produce sound, so it makes sense that they are called the string family. There are 4 main string instruments. These are the violin, the viola, the cello, and the bass. Each of these instruments can be plucked or bowed. As you can see here, the main difference between the 4 instruments is their size. As with any instrument, the smaller it is, the higher pitches it plays. And the larger the instrument is, the lower pitches it plays. A very common arrangement would have the violins playing the melody, and the violas, cellos, and basses playing supporting roles. This is not always the case, but it's important to know. These instruments are some of the oldest instruments made for the modern orchestra, and some early orchestral music is even written solely for this section. Lastly, the harp and the piano are sometimes included in the string family, just depending on the time period when the music was being played. The next largest section of the orchestra is usually the woodwind family. Most woodwind instruments use a small piece of wood called a reed to produce their vibration. The reed vibrates when air is blown across it. This is how instruments like the clarinet work. Saxophones also use a reed. This is why they are classified as a woodwind and not a brass instrument. As far as instruments go, saxophones are fairly new, having only been created in the mid-1840s. Because of this, there aren't really many orchestral pieces that include saxophone. Some woodwind instruments have a reed that has 2 parts called a double reed. Instruments like the oboe and the bassoon use a double reed. In this case, both reeds vibrate and tend to create a nasal sound. There's also one woodwind which uses just the wind part. It's the flute. The flute does not have a reed. Instead, the player just blows across a hole in the instrument, much like you would do if you were blowing across the top of a pop bottle. You might have noticed that this family has all the instruments with a ton of buttons, or keys as they're actually called, on them. One of the most challenging parts of playing a woodwind instrument is just knowing which keys to press down and getting your fingers to the right spots without getting tangled. Once mastered, a woodwind player can play quickly with ease, as you can hear in Bach's Partita for flute. In the orchestra, the higher-pitched woodwinds like flute and oboe tend to play the melody, while lower-pitched woodwinds like bassoon tend to play supporting harmonic parts. It's on to the brass family. The brass family gets its name from the shiny material that its instruments are made from. All brass instruments use the player's lip vibration and air to make sound. The player's lips vibrate rapidly against a metal mouthpiece, and the buzzing sound produced bounces and echoes its way through the instrument to make a tone you're probably familiar with. Unlike the woodwind instruments, brass instruments have few keys. In fact, the trombone doesn't have any keys. It just uses a slide. Of course, the brass player does have more than just 3 notes available to them through pressing the keys. Brass players also change notes through changing the shape of their lips, where tenser lips play higher pitches and looser lips play lower pitches. If you've heard taps, you've heard a brass player just using their lips to change notes. The 5 main brass instruments in the orchestra are the trumpet, the horn, the trombone, the euphonium, and the tuba. In the orchestra, trumpets and horns occasionally play the melody, but much of the brass section's job is to play supporting notes. All the way in the back of the orchestra, we have the percussion family, known for its loud banging and crashing. The percussion family has instruments that are struck or shaken to make their vibrations. Early orchestras didn't have much percussion and usually just had low-pitched drums called timpani or kettle drums to accompany the melody. Other drums like the snare drum and the bass drum were added later. And apparently, composers really like percussion instruments because they haven't stopped adding to the long list of available sounds. Aside from drums, the percussion family includes cymbals, auxiliary percussion like the tambourine, triangle, shakers, or maracas, and mallet instruments like bells, xylophone, and marimba. Most of the time, percussion instruments play a supporting role, though bells and xylophone occasionally get the melody. You now know that the 4 families of the orchestra are the string, woodwind, brass, and percussion families. The string family uses string vibration, the woodwind family uses reed and air vibration, the brass family uses lip vibration, and the percussion family contains instruments that are struck or shaken to make vibration.
In this module, we've covered keyboard instruments in great detail, as well as looking at orchestral instruments. In your manual on page 12, there's some questions for you to answer about other instruments. I look forward to receiving your homework. And remember, if you have any questions, please let me know. I'm here to help you every step of the way. Have a super duper week. Bye.